Welcome to the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast with your host, Tony Guerra. The Pharmacy Leaders Podcast is a member of the Pharmacy Podcast Network, with interviews and advice on building your professional network, brand, and a purposeful second income from students, residents, and innovative professionals.
Welcome to the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast. I wanted to have a special episode to talk with Tim Church about his book, or his and Tim Albrecht's book, because I'm an author, and it was a really tough road. It took me over a year to get the book out, 10 years to get the content, really, if you look at my path. And I know a lot of you would benefit from having some kind of side product. The new tax code, I am not a tax advisor giving tax advice, but I've heard the new tax code is favoring LLCs that are product-based over service-based. And so again, I've just heard that's what's going through Congress right now. But what I wanted to talk with Tim about was to learn about these 6 prescriptions, talk through each of them in depth, and get a little bit of advice from him. So Tim, welcome to the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast.
Thanks for having me back, Tony.
Okay, so the first thing we talk about is an ounce of prevention. And so the first kind of prescription you talk about is preventative financial medicine. But I want to break that up into 3 parts. I want to talk about finances in pre-pharmacy, finances in pharmacy school, and then finances after pharmacy school. Because each of us has our own awakening, maybe a little different time. And then as you kind of talk about the different parts, I'll talk about my mistakes, including buying a car 2 months before I graduated, and then taking out student loans after pharmacy school. So we'll talk about those mistakes too. But let's start with pre-pharmacy. So you're thinking about pharmacy school. You're concerned about the cost. How would you save money and prevent financial ruin before you even get there?
Well, number one, I would see, are there any opportunities where I could not have to go into debt? Could I get it completely free and not have to pay for anything? Well, that's pretty tough. There's not many ways that you can do that. And given how expensive pharmacy school is, there are a couple scholarships that are out there. There's a couple through the military that you may be eligible for, but that obviously would make you have a commitment to doing that service. Obviously, if you have the savings already, or you have savings from family members that can help you out, anything that you can do to put you in a good position, the least amount of debt that you have to take out, the better off you're going to be. Because anything that you're purchasing, any money that's going into school, that interest is accruing. It's completely unsubsidized when you're going into pharmacy school, meaning that the interest, it keeps accumulating the minute the loan is dispersed, essentially. So it's always accumulating, it's always growing. And that's how it becomes such a larger number at the end when you graduate versus what you actually borrowed.
While I normally put in a plug for community college, which I can do, at $150 a credit hour, you can finish your pre-pharmacy requirements for $10,000 total for those 2 years. But tell me some of the maybe things that you've seen in terms of number of years. So have you seen people maybe going to the 2-year route instead of the 4-year route now? Or do you have any advice in terms of how long they should do pre-pharmacy to be successful in pharmacy school? Because obviously the longer they're in undergrad, generally the more they're going to pay.
Yeah, I think it really depends on what school. If you're looking for a specific school, they have different requirements. Some schools require degrees now. They require bachelor's degrees.
I've heard that, yeah.
So that may require you do 2 to 4 years of school to get that. Whereas other pharmacy schools that are accelerated, sometimes, you can get everything done in 6 years and you don't necessarily need a degree. So I think that a lot of that planning comes on where you're actually looking to go. Is it somewhere specific? Are you limited by your geography, or could you go to another school if it's cheaper? Or so I think there's a lot of variables that sort of go into that. But if you're looking at the PharmD, which is the standard degree that everyone comes out with, that when you have the PharmD, you can practice. And when you're registered and licensed in that state. And so what we recommended in the book, and what we recommend, is you find the best fit school for you. But if you can do that by picking the one that costs the least amount, that's also the best fit, that's really the route that you want to take.
Okay, so let's go into pharmacy school from pre-pharmacy. We're seeing 3-year schools come out, and they say that the savings. Obviously, you get to start working 1 year earlier, 1 year less of maybe rent, and University of California, San Francisco actually went from 4 to 3 years, and San Francisco housing might even justify that you have 1 less year of housing in San Francisco, which is extremely expensive. But tell me, but what I've heard is that the overall tuition doesn't change. So you're still paying as much in those 3 years as you did 4. Is it still worth it to go to a 3-year school if the tuition is the same? Or is that maybe more of a personal decision?
Yeah, I think it is. It's more of a personal decision. It goes into play is how fast do you want to graduate and get out of school? Do you have to be in that location? I mean, I think there's just a lot of factors that are going into that. But whether you choose that route or a traditional 4-year PharmD, I think the idea is the same, is that number one, you want to find out exactly how much it's going to cost you. And that's where I think a lot of people make the mistake, is they don't realize all of the costs associated with it. It's not just the tuition. It's like you said, it's the housing. It's the other things that you need to budget for in order to live, but also pay all of the fees and what you need to actually go through school. So I think that's really an important point, is to know that number and know what it's going to take for you to live off of, versus the mantra of, well, just take out the max that you can every year, and you're just going to pay the rest back.
I need an Excedrin. Yeah, I just, that, yeah. Yeah, and anytime I hear, well, I took the max, I'm just like, just in case what, and I understand that there's a need for safety, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But
unfortunately, most people, they're not paying that back. You're blowing it, and I know that because I did it.
Okay, yeah, we'll talk about what happens after in a second. But my own story is that I really wanted to give myself a present for making it through pharmacy school. So one of my APPI rotations was in Arizona. So I went to a Toyota dealership, bought a car, left it on the lot in March. So I asked them, well, I don't have any money for a down payment. It's like, oh, you can put the down payment from a credit card. So $3,000 more on a credit card, so I could walk off the plane and have a car. So I managed to go $20,000 in debt in one day, so that was kind of my maybe bonehead moment as I left pharmacy school. But what advice were you giving in the book, or what advice are you giving to prevent additional financial, I don't want to say ruin, but I guess when you owe $160,000 or more, you're kind of, which I think is the average, you're thinking, what's another drink on the Titanic? Is it sinking? How do you turn that around? How do you turn that around and say, okay, we just got to slow it down?
Right. And especially I think that if you've restricted yourself and you've lived very frugally during pharmacy school, there's that need that when you see that big salary, that you want to go out and reward yourself and buy something big, whether it's a home, a car, or something else. And there's certainly a tendency to do that, but I think you need to be in the right position. But if you look at the interest rates, especially with most unsubsidized loans that graduate students are going to be receiving, they're anywhere from 6 to 8%.
Again, and that was back in my time. I thought they went down to like 2, 3. Are they back up?
For undergrad, they may be lower, but when you're actually borrowing for pharmacy school, what's available through the Department of Education, they're up there still. They're around 6 to 8%.
Okay.
And so when you look at that interest that accrues, I mean, anything else that you're purchasing that you're adding to it, it really puts yourself in a worse position than what you were when you graduated. And I made the same mistake similar to you did, Tony, with the car. I mean, this is what I did. I had about $200,000 in student loan debt when I graduated, and that was a combination of pharmacy and undergrad.
Okay.
And so I didn't think that was enough, so I had to add $26,000 more of debt with a nice looking Honda Accord.
Well, at least you got a nice car.
Yeah, well, I still have the car. It's paid off now. But if I could go back, I wouldn't have made that purchase. I would have done something that I could have paid cash for, that I could, that was a decent, reliable car that wouldn't have added so much more debt to what I had to pay off. Because the reality is that even with a good salary, pharmacists especially, because you start out with such a great salary, you're subjected and you're prone to something called lifestyle creep. It's also called hyperbolic discounting, where however much money you make, you're going to spend at least up to that income and possibly even more. And so when a lot of your chunk of money is going towards debt, it's hard to make progress in some of the other goals that you're doing.
Okay, so let's go from the mess that we made to now. Okay, we're gonna make a plan. So tell me a little bit about the basics of making a financial plan, maybe a first step, or how do we outline that? I think when I talked to Tim on our show, he said how, I don't want to say embarrassing, but it was almost like, when you show someone your financials, it's like you're naked. You're like, here, this is what I've done, right. And now you want to make a plan. So I think, maybe, who do I talk to, or who can I talk to? What's a first step I can take to make that financial plan or manufacture a financial plan?
Well, so there's a couple different ways to go about it. I think that the most important thing is you really need to get clarity on your situation. So if you have multiple student loan lenders, you need to know exactly how much you owe. You need to know if you have any assets. And so I think one of the things that we talked about in the book is keeping that net worth in mind. And so your net worth is just simply your total amount of your assets, what you own minus what you owe. And keeping that in mind and thinking the mindset should be, how do I improve my net worth? How do I get to a better net worth as time goes on? And so that's kind of a good way to at least to start and look at where you are with your position. Now, there's a number of plans that are out there in terms of, okay, well, what step do I do first? What do I do second? And what we put in the book, we just mentioned a couple. We mentioned Dave Ramsey's Baby Steps, and then we also mentioned the Compass Map by Howard Dayton, which is very similar. But essentially, with those plans, for the most part, you're really knocking out all of your debt first before you get aggressive with investing. Now, the Compass Map with Howard Dayton, he would say that you should, if you have an employee match, that you would put into your match and then really get aggressive with your debt and then go back to invest more. So there's a lot of controversy out there in terms of how to do that. And not everyone agrees. And, those are just some suggestions that we have if you just really don't know what direction to take or you don't feel comfortable about your plan.
Okay, so let's take into the next kind of group. We just passed the holidays. A number of people are going to have a little bit of shock when they look at their credit card like, wait, did I buy that? Did you buy that? Did we buy that? And in a partnership, in a marriage, there's always, we keep everything separate, but I know many families keep things together. What does it mean to protect and maximize your income? I don't think you're talking about working, 60 hours a week, 80 hours a week overtime. What is it? What are some strategies that maybe we can use to maximize our income and protect it?
Well, I think it depends on what your goals are and how fast you want to achieve them. So it could mean working 60 hours. I mean, I had a friend of mine, he was working 3 pharmacy jobs because he wanted to get out of student loan debt as fast as he could. So he was working 60, maybe plus hours. Okay. Wow. But so, we put that chapter in there with maximizing your income, which is really looking at, if you want to accelerate your goals or you want to get to a good position, that here are some opportunities and things you can do to grow that top line number. So beyond your normal day-to-day job with your salary, that there are other opportunities. So a lot of times people will say, well, a pharmacist's salary is fixed. Well, relatively speaking, it may be, but the income is not. And so there, you want to look for those opportunities where you can provide value and how you serve people, and that's how you gain income. And then we talk a little bit about, what are some of the things you can do with your income tax, which now are going to change. Some of them are going to change with the new tax code, but just certainly making sure you get all the deductions that you're eligible for and that you can, is certainly also going to help bring with what you're bringing home and help you achieve those goals that you're trying, that you want.
Okay, so we're going to take a step into the next section, which is about shortening the amount of time it takes to pay off your loans. My own personal story is that I became a real estate agent about maybe, '01. So I would have been a pharmacist for 4 years. And I met an accountant and he said, you need kills. That's what you're missing. And what a kill to him was a big check, like a $5,000 check or a $10,000 check coming from somewhere else that was over and above what you made. And one day, I just had gotten good at the real estate. I just got sick of the loans and I just sent a $43,000 check. And that was back in the day where that was maybe a lot of money. Now that's a small amount of the debt. And then for my wife, I had done well with the real estate and moved here, and the mistake of maybe having a joint account is that your wife can see exactly how much you have and exactly how much she has. And she's like, wow, you could totally pay off my student loans if you really wanted to. And, and it was, in jest, she was being funny about it. But I think in one way she was being not funny at all. And she was like, look, man, we're married, dude, and we're in this for life. So
right.
Why do I have why do I have student loan debt when you have X number of dollars from your houses? And
it's kind of like, right. It's like, I don't have debt. We have debt, Tony, right?
Yeah. We had children, but you have debt, and so it became, I just gave her, I didn't give her $25,000 for Christmas, but I paid off her student loans because I felt bad about it. But, now I have 3 bank accounts, but I won't go into that. But tell me a little bit about shortening the half-life of this debt, because what I did was I found outside income through, we'll talk about the books later, but through real estate, through teaching gigs, through other things. What are some techniques to shorten that half-life, to shorten the amount of time it's going to take for you to pay that off?
It really comes down to either one of two things. We talked about it in the last section where you can maximize your income, you can grow that top line. So as long as that extra income is going towards the debt and not going to fund your lifestyle, that can help you get in the right direction. And then the other thing is obviously cutting back on your expenses. And that's something that's been sort of fun. My wife and I have worked through and looked for all the ways on things that we really don't need that show up in the budget that come there. And, we're fine without it. We're content and we're still living great lives when we're really knocking out our student loans and going on that. But those are really the two big strategies. It's not like it's not anything very scientific. It really comes down to how much are you willing to sacrifice, number one, in terms of how fast you want to get rid of your debt, and how much are you willing to work if you want to grow that top line and get extra income to help expedite it.
As someone who did pay them off eventually, I can tell you that it wasn't a feeling of elation. It was a feeling of relief. It was just, I don't know, I think I got 2 inches taller or something like that. It was just this thing that was on my shoulders. But you talk a little bit, which in the next section, I think Ben Franklin was the one that said the greatest something or other is compound interest, tell me a little bit about becoming a compounding pharmacist, understanding the power of compound effect, because in the beginning, it doesn't look like a lot. When you make 7% of $100, it's 107. But then over a number of years, that really is exponential. So tell me a little bit about compounding and how you can make it work for you.
Yeah. So, in order to grow in your investments that you put in, it really comes down to the time over which you invest and how much you're investing over that time period. And the way compound interest works, that it works to your advantage, the faster that you can contribute to that, whether that's through your 401k or whether that's through an IRA, but the longer amount of time that you have for the money to compound, because every year when it compounds, it's compounding on the amount before that was already compounded. And like you said, you're not going to see any huge changes at first. It's going to take several years before you can really see that. But eventually, that most of the money that's in your account over a long period of time is going to be from the growth and not actually what you put in through your contributions.
I remember.
But I think that.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that I think one of the hardest things is for people to decide, do I put all of my money on my student loans or do I start investing? Because keeping that in mind with compound interest, you obviously don't want to start late, but you also may have these other financial obligations. And so that's kind of one of the big questions that always comes up in the financial industry. And there's really not one answer. And, people will always debate and argue that. But I think there's so much to be said about your own personal emotions and where you want to be. If you're somebody that you want to pay off your debt as fast as possible at the expense of not investing for X amount of years, then, that's important. You may lose out on some growth, but if it's more important to you to have that feeling, like you said, of relief or that feeling of just, not having that on your shoulders, then I think that's great. And you want to do that. Or if you're someone that you don't want to wait to invest, but you want to put something, that's fine too. So I think there's a lot of emotions and your goals that go into that kind of decision making. But either way you look at it, you want time to work for you. And so the faster that you can start contributing regularly, the better off you're going to be.
So I want to go into your last section, adhere to the habits of the wealthy. I want to tell you a little story first. I was at Fidelity Investments in Scottsdale. I was in Arizona. I think it was my first or second year out as a pharmacist. And I was going to meet with somebody, and I was sitting next to this guy. And I glanced over at his sheet, and he pointed to it, and he said, 6%. That's all I was trying to get. And he had $3.1 million in stocks. And I was just like, 6%? He's like, yeah, man, 40 years, 6%, just keep it going. And that's one of the habits of the wealthy that I think a lot of people are going to struggle with, because now we hear, gosh, if I just bought Bitcoin at $1, or, if I just timed the market and bought it, just a couple of years ago. Well, if you had timed the market in 2006, 2008 would have been a disaster. But they're not looking at that. They're looking at, gosh, if I just bought Bitcoin at 1,000, last year, it's 15,000 now, or whatever the cryptocurrency is. Tell me a little bit about the habits of the wealthy, the maybe slow and steady as it goes, versus the, gosh, I just missed that next boat.
Yeah, I mean, most of the stories that you hear of people that are wealthy, it's not that they hit the lottery. It's not that they made it an awesome decision to get into a certain single stock, but it's really kind of boring. It's not very sexy. A lot of people, they've essentially just lived below their means and always contributed a percentage of their income towards investments, or whether that's real estate or whatever the investments are. And they do that consistently over and over and over and over again. And like you said, it's really that compound interest that works over time. But in order to do that, you have to give up some of your income that you could be using today. And I think that's one of the hardest things to overcome. And we talk a little bit about in the book, it's basically called the present bias, where we're more likely to do things and purchase things and use our money that are going to give us pleasure and happiness today, versus deferring that to a bigger goal that we may never see until 20, 30 years from now. And so it's very difficult to do that, but it's sort of important. And one of the strategies I think for being consistent with that is to really have it come out of your checks automatically. So you never get a chance to actually get the money. It cannot cross into your hands, not even into your bank account. It's already gone, and you can't actually realize that. So I think automating any kind of savings that you're doing towards your investments is just such a really important strategy.
So automation, pay yourself first. I've heard of a lot of these things. Well, is there anything that we didn't cover about the book that we went through the 6 prescriptions to help you achieve financial success? Is there anything that we didn't cover? And then where would people get it if they did want to get it?
Yeah, I think the only other thing we touched on a little bit was about debt, but we have a whole chapter on student loans. And one of the chapters is how do you manage student loan debt once you already have it, and looking at what are your strategies for that. And then we have a chapter in the beginning under the preventative financial medicine section for pharmacy students who are kind of going through it, and how do you minimize the amount of debt that you're going through. So we really make a point to highlight those. And then there's actually a whole appendix on all of the pharmacy scholarships that students could be eligible for that are national scholarships. And so right now we sell it through our website. That's at sevenfigurepharmacist.com. And if anybody wants to get a discount, if they put the code podcast in, you actually could get a 20% discount on that.
Awesome. And then can you tell me a little bit about the calculators? Where do they find those?
For your financial pharmacist?
Yeah. So you mentioned some calculators and some tools.
What we've recently done on Your Financial Pharmacist, we implemented two calculators. One is a refinance calculator. So looking at, really the intent was for student loans. So if you were able to refinance your loans from a 7% interest rate to a 4% over that term, how much would you save? And that's really, it could be substantial. I mean, if you look at a pharmacist who has typical student loan debt of $160,000 and they drop their interest rate just by a couple percentages, it can be, $30,000 to $40,000 in savings over that. So that's really a big. So we have that calculator. That's at yourfinancialpharmacist.com//refinance. You can get it. And then we also have another calculator under the resource tab. It's called an early payoff calculator. So you can see if you're making extra payments than what's your monthly. So let's say you wanted to put $500 extra per month or $1,000 extra per month on your debt. That could be your mortgage, your student loan, credit card. How much faster would you pay it off and how much would you save in interest? And there's also what you kind of had alluded to earlier is, well, what if you run into a big chunk of money? What if you run into a big chunk like a tax return, a bonus or gift or something like that? How would that impact the payoff? And so there's actually it's pretty cool. You can put that input in there as well to see how that affects your payoff.
Okay, awesome. All right. Well, thanks so much for all of your advice, and thanks for being on the Pharmacy Leaders podcast.
Thanks, Tony. It's a pleasure. Thanks for listening to the podcast. This is Tim Church from Your Financial Pharmacist. And if you head on over to sevenfigurepharmacist.com, you can get 20% off your purchase by entering the code podcast. Seven Figure Pharmacist is a book written by pharmacists for pharmacists and will help you learn how to protect and transform your amazing income into wealth.
Support for this episode comes from Good Night Pharmacology, 350 brand and generic name drugs with classifications, a leading resource for students in the United States, United Kingdom, and Australia. Print, ebook, and audiobook available on Audible, iTunes, and Amazon.com. Thank you for listening to the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast with your host, Tony Guerra. Be sure to share the show with the hashtag #PharmacyLeaders.